Hello friends, this is Hatim Rampurawala, and in this video we will cover SS 620, that is using the work of Auditors expert. We'll quickly revise this essay without wasting a second. Meaning of the Auditors expert. So what is the meaning of Auditors expert and who is an expert? Sorry, an individual or the organization possessing an expertise in the field other than the auditing and accounting, whose work is used by the auditor to assist the auditor in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Area where the work of the auditor's expert can be used. So these are the examples where the work can be used. There can be other areas as well, but if it is asked in exam, we have to write this specific area where the work of an auditor's expert can be used. So first is valuation of the complex financial instrument. Basically valuation of financial instrument, land and building, plant and machinery, jewelry, work of art, antiques, intangible assets acquired, and the liability assumed in the business combination, and the assets that may have been impaired. So what it is, valuations basically of the complex financial instrument, land and building, plant and machinery, jewelry, intangibles, antiques, share acquired, and the liability assumed in the business combination. Then the assets that have been impaired, intangible assets. Okay, then second is actual calculation of the liabilities associated with the insurance contract or the employee benefit plan. So basically there are two things in this. There is actual calculation of the liabilities associated with first insurance contract, second employee benefit plan, third estimation of the oil and gas reserves. So for this estimation purpose, we can hire the expert whose work can be used by the auditor. Then valuation of the environmental liability site cleanup cost. So see, this estimation and all gas reserve, estimation of the oil and gas reserve, then valuation of the environmental liabilities and site cleanup cost. Then the second one, which was that actual calculation of the liabilities associated, we will hire basically, we will take the service of actuaries who perform, that is for the calculation of the liabilities associated with the insurance contract or employee benefits. So first we'll hire an expert for the valuation of the complex financial instrument, land and building and all stuff. Second, actuary we will hire basically for the calculation of the liability associated with the employee benefit and the insurance contract. Third, for an expert who will assist in estimation of the oil and gas reserves. Then the valuation of the environmental liability and the site cleanup cost. Interpretation of the contract law and regulation. So who is expert basically in interpretation of contracts, laws and regulation, some specific laws or regulation or contracts. So that person basically. So see, first one was valuation, fourth was valuation. First one was valuation related to land and building, plant and machinery, jewelry, articles and all, intangibles, assets acquired in business combination. Fourth was valuation of the environmental liability site cleanup cost. Second was actuarial liability in relation to insurance contract and the employee benefit plan. And third is estimation of oil gas reserve. Fifth is interpretation of the contract laws and regulation and the analysis of the complex unusual tax compliances and this. So fifth and sixth is in relation to the compliance basically. So you can remember like this way, that is interpretation of the contract laws and regulation, then complex or the unusual, analysis of the complex or unusual tax compliances issue. Okay, so we are done with that part. Then the procedure to be followed while using the work of the auditor's expert. So it seems a little big in the sense there are six steps procedure to be followed while using the work of the auditor's expert. And there is another concept, there is last concept, there is reference to the auditor's expert in the auditor's report. So reference to the auditor's expert. So what I will first do is give you a brief glance of these all 6 points, and then we'll study then we'll go through each and every point. Okay, so first is determining the need for the auditor's expert. I will zoom it a little bit. First is determining the need for the auditor's expert. So first, auditor will identify that whether there is any need for using the service of the auditor's expert. So whether he will determine the need first of hiring the auditor's expert. Then second, he will evaluate after hiring. He will not after hiring, first while evaluating only, he will evaluate the competency, capability, objectivity of the expert. Then after evaluating the competency capability expert, then he will obtain an understanding of expert work. What he will do, that he will understand that the work of that expert is basically useful for the auditor or not. So first he will determine the need for the auditor's expert, whether there is any need. He will check the compliance, he will evaluate the compliance capability, objectivity. Third, he will obtain an understanding of the auditor's expert, that whether his work would be useful for the auditor or not. Then if it is useful, so he will use the work, so he will basically take the service of the auditor's expert. Then he will enter into an agreement with the auditor's expert to determine the nature, scope, objectivity, responsibility, roles and responsibility of each other and all. Then after this agreement with the auditor's expert, then he will evaluate the appropriateness of the expert work. This evaluation of the appropriateness of the expert work is same point as that of SA, same wordings as well of SA 500. In that also we had studied there is finding, conclusion, assumptions, method and the source data, the relevance, reasonableness, completeness, accuracy, consistency and all thing. And the last point is, that is what we will do is, after entering into agreement, we will evaluate the appropriateness of his work, that whether it is the work is findings is relevant, reasonable and all. And the last sixth step is expert work not adequate for the audit. So if the after the expert being performing his part of his work, he will evaluate and he will conclude that if the expert work is not adequate, so what the auditor will basically do in that case. Okay, so we'll go one by one. First step, determine the need of an expert work. Auditor's expert may be needed to assist the auditor for the following. So auditor's expert is needed to assist the auditor. What auditor expert will do, will assist the auditor in the following areas. First, not in following areas, for following. How means, for what purpose he will assist? Basically, we need to assist the auditor for the following. First, obtaining an understanding of the entity and its environment, including the internal control. This line is similar to SA 315, that is obtaining an understanding of an entity and its environment, including the internal control. Then identification and assessing the risk of material misstatement. Then determining and implementing the overall response to the assessed risk. That is basically what is the work of an auditor, to understand the entity. So in that, the process of understanding, auditor expert will help. Then in identifying the risk of material misstatement is the work of the auditor. So in that step, that is in identification, assessing of risk of material misstatement, auditor expert will help the auditor. So that's what they have given. Why the need of the auditor expert arise, that is in that the work of the auditor expert can be used in the following area, that is in obtaining an understanding of an entity, including internal control. Then in identification and assessment of the risk of material misstatement. Then its work can be useful during determining implementation of the overall response to the assessed risk, that is 313 as per 330. Then design and performing the further audit procedure to response to the assessed risk, 330. Evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of an audit evidence obtained. So what auditor do is we have seen in SA 500 on as well, that what auditor do is obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. So in evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness, the work of the expert can be used. So these are the needs where the work of the expert can be used. So basically this is, just write the points of 315 and 330. You can also notice in this, that is first is obtain understanding and its entity, and including obtaining understanding of the entity and its environment, including internal control. I will just quickly read out. Identify and assessing the risk of material misstatement, determining and implementing the overall responses to the assessed risk. In these all matters, the work of an expert can be, means these all areas where we can need the work of an expert. These are not an areas, man, we have studied the areas. These is the auditor's expert may need to assist the auditor for the following. These are not areas, but to assist in the following process, you can say. In following process, in obtaining and understanding process, identification of the risk of material misstatement in that process, then determining the implementation, then designing the further audit procedure, then evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of an audit evidence obtained. Okay, so this was, the heading was determining the need of an auditor's expert. We are done with this. Then we'll move on to the second step, that is second procedure step, that is evaluate the competency, capability and objectivity of the expert work. So now we have seen in SA 500 as well, they have given that how, not in SA 500, sorry, in SA 610 we have seen, see this point, I think so in 6, wait a second, In which point we have seen SS 600, I think so. It could be SF 500. Okay, that we'll understand by reading. That how we'll evaluate the competency, capability, and objectivity of the expert. First, personal experience with the previous work, discussion with the expert, discussion with the other auditor, knowledge of the expert, qualification, membership, other forms of recognition, his published books and papers, and quality auditors firm, quality control policy and procedure. Wait a second, we'll quickly go through SF 500 also. Not entire go through, but okay, I said okay, it is we have studied in this SF 500. See this point. First, evaluate the competency, capability of an expert. So means over here it was management expert, and over there it is auditor's expert. So the same points are there. First is personal experience with the previous work, then discussion with that expert. So personal experience with previous work, discussion with that expert, discussion with others, knowledge of the expert, qualification, membership, and other form of recognition, published books or papers. Then auditor's expert, his published books, his qualification, fourth point, qualification, membership, other forms, his published books and papers. Then auditor's expert, over there the last point is different a little bit. See, this can coincide, but it's not exactly, because that was management expert and this is auditor's expert. Over here, see, the last point is different. Auditors firm, quality control policy and procedure. So we are done with this 2-point procedure basically. Then third is obtain understanding of the expert work. Basically we will see that his work is useful for the auditor or not. To enable the auditor to determine the nature, scope, and the objectivity of the expert work for the auditor's purpose. So we'll enable the auditor to obtain an understanding of the expert work, to enable the auditor to determine the nature, scope, and objective of the expert work for the auditor's purpose. So in what area he need basically the work of the expert, evaluate the adequacy of that work for the auditor's purpose. So what is the adequacy of that work for the auditor's purpose? Okay, then fourth point, after we are done that his work is useful for the after we are confirmed that we are using the work of an expert, will enter into an agreement. That is, agreement with the auditor's expert need to be in writing. Wait a second. Okay, so after evaluating basically that the expert work would be adequate for the auditor's work, we will enter into an agreement with the auditor's expert. Need to be in writing and cover the following points. It should be in writing. Need to be in writing and cover the following points. First is nature, scope, and objectives of the expert auditors. Wait a second. Auditors, what I am reading here. What will be in agreement? It should be in writing and cover the following points. First, nature, scope, and objective of the expert work. What will be this nature, scope, and objective of the expert work? Then roles and responsibility of the auditor and that of the expert. What will be the role of the auditor and what will be the role of the auditor's expert? So nature, scope, and objective of the expert auditor's expert work. Then roles and responsibility of both of them, that is auditor and auditor expert. Nature, timing, and extent of the communication, including the form of report. Nature, timing, and communication, that is what will be his nature of work, then what timing of the work, then nature of extent of the communication. So nature, timing, and extent. So what he will communicate, nature of communication, timing, when he will communicate, the extent of communication, nature, timing, and extent of the communication, including the form of report, and confidentiality requirement to be observed by the auditor's expert. That is, auditor is required to maintain confidentiality. In the same way, auditor's expert is also required to maintain the confidentiality. That clause will also be there in the agreement. So what 4 points we seen in the agreement? First was nature, timing, and scope of the auditor's expert work. Then the nature, timing, and extent of the communication and the report. Confidentiality, fourth point, confidentiality requirement to be observed by the auditor's expert. And the second point was the roles and responsibility of the auditor and auditor's expert. We'll again quickly read out this 4 points so that it can be, what we can say, fit into our mind. Nature, scope, and objective of the auditor's expert, roles and responsibility of the auditor and auditor expert. Then third is nature, timing, and extent of the communication and the report. and the form including the form of report. Fourth is confidentiality requirement to be observed by the auditor's expert. So confidentiality requirement needs to be observed by the auditor's expert. Then fifth step procedure, that is evaluate the appropriateness of the expert work. That is we have to evaluate his work, that is finding and the conclusion, relevance, reasonableness and the consistency with the other audit evidence, then assumptions and the method, relevance and the reasonableness, source data, that is really it should be relevant, then it should be complete basically and should be accurate. The source data should be complete, accurate, reasonable, complete and accurate. And sixth step, expert work not adequate for the auditor's purpose. If auditor concludes that his work is not adequate for the auditor's purpose, so over here he was checking in fifth point the appropriateness of his work. Okay, now while checking he concluded that his expert work not adequate for the auditor's purpose. First, auditor concludes that the work of the auditor's expert is not adequate for the auditor's purpose and auditor cannot resolve the matter through the additional audit procedure. So if he concludes that his work cannot be that is auditor's expert work cannot be used or is not adequate for his purpose, and if he is not getting information, and if the auditor cannot resolve the matter through the additional audit procedure, then it may be necessary for an auditor to express the modified opinion, because he is left with no choice. There is a limitation of scope, that is because the work is not adequate. Second, he cannot resolve the matter through the additional audit procedure. So if he is not able to resolve basically through the additional audit procedure, then he may need to express a modified opinion. Okay, need to express the modified opinion. And the last concept is, oh my god, 16 minutes have already been done. Reference to the auditor's expert, then too it's okay, we had covered the most and in proper manner. Reference to the auditor expert, so by this you would have got this whole 6 point, that is first was determining the need of the auditor's expert, then evaluate the competency, capability and objectivity, then obtain an understanding of his work, then agreement with the auditor's expert, evaluate the appropriateness, and if it is not appropriate, then what he will do, he will modify the report. A reference to the auditor's expert in the audit report. No reference required in case of an unmodified opinion. So no reference is required in unmodified opinion unless required by the laws or regulation. If law and regulation say so, even if it is unmodified, auditor will give the reference of the auditor's expert. Second, in case of the modified report, it may be appropriate to refer the auditor's expert. It may appropriate to refer to the auditor's expert to explain the nature of the modification. So in case of the modification, it may be appropriate to refer the auditor's expert to explain. So auditor expert will basically give his reasoning. It may be appropriate to refer to auditor's expert to explain that. It may be over here if the auditor has given the modification based on the conclusion reached by the auditor's expert. So for explaining this modification, he need to refer the auditor's expert that this individual or the organization was an auditor's expert in this case, and he has given this modification, or whosoever it has given the modification, this opinion. Based on that, auditor has modified the report to explain the nature of the modification. In such a case, auditor may need the permission of the auditor's expert before making such reference. And even in case of any modification, if he is giving the reference for the clear understanding, he has to take the permission of the auditor expert. Okay, so we are done with SS 620. Thank you for watching video.